So welcome everybody, ladies and gentlemen, to this webinar dedicated to a study to power our buildings through electrification of energy consumption, something dealing with energy efficiency and decarbonization. I wish to thank our partner IECP for their cooperation in the drafting of the study, and especially Enel for their support and for giving us this opportunity. So first of all, allow me to give the floor to Mario Tagliani De Marchio for a brief introduction. Please, Mario.
Good morning. Thank you, Dario. Thank you, Dario. Good morning to everybody. I'm Mario Tagliani, head of European Associations and Stakeholders at Enel, and I'm very pleased to welcome you on behalf of my company. Just a few words on my side. In Enel, we believe that electrification means thinking, building, and implementing new ways of using energy. And we also believe that the road to net zero emission economy can only pass through an increase in the use of renewable sources and the electrification of uses and consumption. This both in the industry and in the residential sector. This is especially true in city areas, where as Enel, we are strongly focused on developing a sustainable urban vision. The building sector, as you may know, is one of the most energy intensive. At the same time, is one of the most polluting. But it's also a sector that shows one of the highest potentials for electrification. Therefore, the equation should be simple. Increasing energy efficiency and decarbonizing through electrification of buildings is a game changer. Actually, it's not that simple, because we know that there are a number of obstacles, and this study is very important, the study that is gonna be presented today, because it helps us identify these obstacles. Let me just add one last remark. Europe's sector in building is very well positioned, and a green transition will certainly create more local jobs, more innovation, and more investments. So this is a further reason to start electrifying as quickly as possible. I don't want to take any more time away from this morning discussion, so thank you very much for being here, and I'm looking forward to the panel. Thank you, Dario.
Thank you very much, Mario, for this introduction. And by the way, thank you to all of you who are present here today. Just some words to say that the study, the executive summary, and also the registration of this webinar will be available on our website in the following days, the study since now, and it can also be downloaded through the control panel of GoToWebinar. You can feel free to ask all your questions you want during the session. We will try to direct your questions to our panelists during the roundtable. And now we will have two presentations to illustrate and summarize the study from me and Ivana Roguli from IECP. Then DG Ener will illustrate the current situation in terms of policy and programs. And after that, we will go through the roundtable. So let's start with our study. I've also liked pictures of the Earth taken from the space, because this point of color in this black amber is really beauty. And in a sense, it has always turned on in me a feeling of preservation of this beauty. And as you know, we just reached the 8 billion people threshold, which is quite an achievement, because in just 50 years, we doubled the population of our planet. And of course, this will put additional pressure on the resources of our planet. Pressure which is even worsened by the fact that these resources are not equally distributed among the countries. So for sure, it's difficult to continue to think in terms of business as usual scenarios that we considered in the last decades. And for sure, it is time to do something to relieve this pressure, to change things. Among these, the use of energy is very important, and there are many reasons to improve it. The first one is to reduce greenhouse gases emissions and pollution, especially in our cities. The second one is to decrease our dependencies from fossil fuels and the associated risks of costs and even availability. The third one is to increase the resiliencies of our energy system. Then we have to thrive to improve our lives, and this is especially true for people who live in fuel poverty or for people who live in cities with degraded air quality or conditions. And it's much truer, of course, for people living outside the EU in poorer countries. Last of all, and not least, of course, to increase the sustainability. And of course, energy is one of the dimensions of sustainability. Allow me to say something more. While we are presenting this study, there are people with no access to electricity. Some of them which are very next to us because of war, some others just because we were unlucky and maybe were born in poor suburbs or in countries without access to energy and electricity. A reason more to reduce the energy demand in our buildings. And to start from our buildings makes a lot of sense, since we are responsible of around 40% of EU energy consumption and 36% of greenhouse gas emissions. And it's not the case that the European Commission put a priority over the reduction of the energy demand of our building stock. A building stock which is consuming energy, especially for space heating, in some countries also for cooling, something which is increasing in many cases energy service. Then there is water heating, and there is lighting with over electrical appliances. Last but not least, there is cooking, especially of course in households. So a lot of uses, among which the main one is space heating, which is, by the way, the one to start with. And to make our buildings more efficient, we can start from a building envelope to reduce the energy demand, an important factor because it allows to reduce both peak power and energy required by all the other energy services in the building, starting from, of course, from heating, cooling, and ventilation, which, by the way, mainly can be improved by adopting more efficient technology like heat pumps, but also they can contribute to the reduction of energy demand by, for example, by controlling the internal temperatures in our buildings. Or sometimes they can even add energy demand by adding energy services like cooling, which is an increasing requirements of our European Union, or increasing heating, especially in poorer households. The other technologies and the other services like domestic hot water, cooking, and lighting can mainly be improved by adopting more efficient technologies. And then there is an additional energy consumption which is linked to the smart building, so building automation control, which is in itself an increase of energy demand, but it allows to reduce the energy demand of all the other energy services with a net contribution to the reduction of energy demand, and also to the increase and the improvement of the general condition of the buildings, because all these services take with them, if improved, non-energy benefits, like an increased comfort, an increased health due to better condition, especially for poor families, an increased safety. Electricity in itself increases the safety with respect to, for example, the use of natural gas, and also the asset value of our buildings, which is increased by increasing their building energy certificate class. To do that, electrification technologies can play a really important role, because the best available technology for heating and cooling are electric heat pumps. The same is true for domestic hot water. We have cooking means like induction hobs or microwave ovens that can drastically improve the energy efficiency of cooking. And then we have the smart building system, which is very important to increase the energy efficiency of your services, to better control them, and also to integrate the charging of electric vehicles within our buildings. Of course, this is not a building energy use, in fact, but it's something we will increase and will create a lot of interchange of energy flows between the vehicles and our buildings. And of course, all these can be integrated with renewable energy sources, integrated with a building envelope or just installed over the rooftop to produce electricity, in case in combination with energy communities. So we have a lot of opportunities to increase the energy efficiency of our buildings. The main path is to start with the reduction of energy demand, so through building envelope, then increase the energy efficiency of the other services, integrate renewables, use BACs to improve the working of all the other energy services, and also change usage patterns. That is both to adopt the correct temperatures and also air quality within our houses, but also these technologies like heat pumps can produce the better results, especially if coupled with renewable energy sources, by changing the usage pattern with respect, for example, to a gas boilers. Especially if the inertia of the building is high, we can produce more heat or cooling, depending on the season, during the day to increase at best the usage of photovoltaic power, for example. And then using the inertia of the building fabric to get the heat during the night. But of course, this holistic approach is not always possible. And in other cases, we can just adopt some of these opportunities. For example, nowadays we have high temperature heat pumps that allow to renovate the building energy efficiency for heating and cooling, even without touching the building envelope and the distribution system within the house. So we have many opportunities, and these many opportunities, of course, require skilled and qualified people to deal with them. We need technicians, designers, installers, maintainers, utilities, ESCOs, and renovation companies, but able to understand the right technology mix to propose to the single family, to the single building owner, to produce the better result, both in terms of energy, emissions, and of course, economy, depending also on the available support policies that each country has at disposal. And of course, this requires also that end user will understand this new technology, understand how to use them, and make the best out from them. So habits can be changed, and in all this, an important role can be played, of course, by policies, but also by technology producers that can help in increasing and improving the qualification of all the market operators, and also in the information of the end users. Generally speaking, these are two of the barriers that we face and that have been analyzed deeply in the study. In this table, you have a summary of them with highlighted in sort of blue the most important ones. Two of them are, of course, operator skills and users' attitudes and habits. We can add the lack of user expertise, meaning that in a lot of cases, people don't have their relatives, friends, cousins, etc., that already adopted this type of new technology, so they don't know them, and sometimes they're afraid of them. Will they work as expected? Do I have to change my habits? Will I get the degrees Celsius I need within my buildings? Of course, yes, things are done well, but this is a barrier to overcome in terms of information, of course. Then there is challenging integration and complexity, which are typical of energy efficiency, but are typical also of this kind of electrification technology. For example, the capability of the cabling within the houses to sustain the increasing electricity demand. Then there is the tariff barrier, meaning two things. First one is that in many countries, electricity is more costly of gas to produce and thermal kilowatt hour due to the difference in taxation and levies. And sometimes in some country like Italy, there is also the structure of the cost of electricity that doesn't favor an increase in peak power within the building. Last but not least at all is the need to improve our grids, the distribution network in particular, through digitalization, in order to allow it to make the best with the integration of all these technologies. So production of energy among the buildings, connection with electric vehicles, and energy demand of our buildings. So there is a lot to do. And all this action, it's combining with growing and increasing targets linked to our policy. This is a figure from the European Heat Pumps Association that highlights how the installation of heat pumps should rise to meet the targets of the REPowerEU plan. And this is a steep increase over the years that can be done, but it requires support. It requires to mitigate or better overcome the barriers. It requires a lot of action. In a sense, we are moving from an issue of demand. So in the last years, the problem was to have enough demand of energy efficiency, to the opposite issue, an issue of supply. So we have a lot of demand, but the supply is not dimensioned to meet it. And this is already a factor in some countries, maybe due to policies like in Italy, the super bonus. So it is very important that we create the condition for the enhancement and the improvement of the value chain of all this electrification technology. Maybe it is better to deal with a problem with the supply than with the problem of demand, but nevertheless, it has its challenges. Finally, the good news is that we have a technology to improve the energy efficiency and reduce the energy demand of our buildings, so to meet the challenges that I highlighted in the beginning of my presentation. However, there are a lot of barriers that need to be mitigated and or overcome, and for that, a very important role is with the policies, which is, by the way, the core of our study. So now I give the floor to Ivana Rogli, so that she can explain the findings and the outcome of our study with respect to that. Please, Ivana, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Dario, and good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar. First of all, I'd like to thank FIRE for the great cooperation we had during the development of the study, and Enel for the opportunity to work on something so interesting. Also, one more thing, to thanking our stakeholders, so the experts in all the areas that we were evaluating, because they gave us a lot of opinions and the market trends and everything that we needed to finalize the study. And you will see their names inside the study, so thanks to the stakeholder board. I'm going to show you a bit about the policies, meaning measures we are suggesting to promote and implement the electrification in the building sector. So first of all, I just want to mention the policies we are targeting. I will not take a lot of time with that, because we have this great opportunity to host a colleague from the European Commission to tell us a bit more about the development in the policy area. But just to mention what are the policies that we've been targeting during our work. So mostly we've been focusing on the energy policies and the climate policies, meaning major focuses on the energy efficiency. With that, you are familiar with the fact that it is EED and EPBD, so Energy Performance of Building Directive. And with them, we are mostly focused on the heating and cooling, fossil fuel bans, and smart technologies in buildings. Also covering eco-design and energy labeling directives, which are dealing with the products and the technologies. So in our case, the importance are the products that are using electricity in buildings, but also the technologies that will help the energy efficiency of the buildings and the electrification. Other than that, we also targeted a lot of policies that might not be directly linked to the electrification and energy efficiency of buildings, but are very helpful or needed for this process. So it will be for sure the ETS extension. I'm going to tell you a bit more later on about it. The taxonomy, which is focusing on the environmental objectives of the investments, so meaning putting a lot of emphasis on the electrification, which is helping the environmental objectives in the energy systems. Then there is also an F-gas directive, very relevant for the heat pumps, for example, electricity market, of course, and renewable energy directive, with the importance of the increase of the share of renewables in the heating and cooling sector. So what we did is try to target the barriers that have been mentioned by Dario in different, let's call them sectors, or different aspects of electrification, and see what are the policies that could be either changed or implemented in a different way, so they could support this this process of electrification. So these are for sure the supply chain for the electrification technology. So what are the barriers there, and what should be done from the policy perspective? So it's also the renovation, of course, the building renovation, which is also including the electrification and the automation of the buildings. And of course, the fossil fuel ban, which is very much relevant in the recast of the current policies. Then as Dario mentioned, that's the attractiveness, the acceptance of the electrification results and choices from the side of the end users. So meaning either industry or SMEs or households, whoever is working and using the energy in the building sector. Then, of course, the regulatory framework, we are very much familiar with the problems, for example, with administrative or bureaucratic issues when implementing renewable energy sources, but there are other regulatory framework issues that are that should be used to remove the market distortions. And then, of course, there's the development of the grid, which in general is a technical issue, but of course, then it's promoted and could be accelerated by the development of the policies. So just a short reminder on the barriers that Dario already mentioned. We divided them in several, let's say, types of barriers. They are either economic, behavioral, informational, technical, or regulatory barriers. And as said, regulatory barriers are rather straightforward and mentioned already. But then again, there's also some very specific dilemmas, like, for example, the one we are working a lot on is a split incentives dilemma on the electrification and energy efficiency in building, and who is the one who enjoys the benefits of energy efficiency, and who is the one who pays in the renter and the person who lives in the apartment. So then there's also a problem for specific groups, like lack of access to finance, which is very relevant for SMEs or for certain groups of households, income groups. And then, of course, there are some economic indicators, especially in the energy efficiency measures. And for this one, it's very relevant to take into consideration the life cycle of the measure, and to take into consideration all the benefits that are coming from it, and so on. You can see all of this in the study. There, the presentation is really informational intensive, so some things I will have to just to keep and leave you to read it in the details in the study. So what we did is trying to find out what are the most relevant recommendations to the policies, and you can see here this is kind of a policy metrics, match them with the relevant policies, so that when we do suggest something that is already linked to a specific, let's say, development of the policy, so it can just be add-on, an update, or a motivation to implement it. So it's very straightforward, not that we are having a theoretical kind of recommendation. What we, as I said, there are several, let's say, groups of recommendation that we focused on. First one is trying to help the supply chain. That means avoid that there are bottlenecks on the, or that when some technology comes to the market, it has costs that are too high for the consumers, or ensuring that there is a process from the manufacturers to installers, and there is a quality. As Dario mentioned, there is a problem on the quality and the skills of the professionals working with some of the new technologies. So this is also something that's very important from the perspective of the policies. So what does it mean? What are the aspects of the supply chain problems? So this means, for example, that markets should be analyzed and monitored very often and in line with the policy development, so that it happens that policy has not been brought to action before it's very clear that the components needed, that the equipment needed is available on the market, could be easily manufactured, or there is a cooperation with, for example, technology associations, SME associations, and so on, who could provide this kind of technology. So this is one of the important things that we considered. This is also linked with the possibility to have platforms for joint purchases, meaning that there is a place that smaller players, like small and medium enterprise, are able to create a supply kind of chain, which is for bigger players already a much easier task. Then, of course, there is the need for more research and development in cooperation with electricity suppliers, so that it's clear what are the needs from the market. On the other side, we also are, so there is, as mentioned, the need for the skilled professionals, the trainings, the qualifications, the certification schemes, and so on, and environmental issues to be dealt before the policy is taken to action. And then, of course, the finances, as we mentioned, finances can be really an issue, especially with innovative technologies. So the innovative business models, guarantees, and new financial solutions are something that is very relevant from the policy perspective. So how is this shown in the policies? For example, for the mentioned market analysis and monitoring, there is a joint research center from the European Commission is doing ongoing research on the demand for the renewables, and it should be also done for the electrification and energy efficiency. For example, integrated national energy and climate plans, which is one of the very important policy documents on a national level, should be more detailed, so that it's easy to see from them what are the needs from the side of the market. Also, for example, there is a platform for joint purchase for the gas, LNG, and hydrogen, deriving from the situation with the purchase of the and the supply of gas. This is something that could be done also for the other aspects, for example, for the equipment that's needed for the electrification. Then, as said, the investment in research and development is very much aligned with the European funding, and should be kind of complemented with this mentioned public-private partnership, so partnership with the supplier companies also. Then for the skilled professionals, there is a lot of mention on the certification, trainings, accreditations, and so on in the new EU energy policy, so EPBD, EED, and Renewable Energy Directive, but it needs to be aligned with the national plans, because even if it's very clear that the certification is needed, there is still lack of experts on the national level, so it should be aligned with the national technical and vocational training plans. Also, the innovative business models have been mentioned in the EED and EPBD, but should be also aligned with the national building renovation plans, for example. So this kind of point, if you see going through all of these points, the one thing that's repeated is the alignment between what's suggested in the European policies and what should be implemented on a national level. So on the other point, so the first one is trying to work on the market and supply of the equipment. The second one that we noticed is very relevant is the renovation of buildings and linking the energy efficiency projects, the renovation of buildings, with the phase out of fossil fuels, taking into consideration the role of electrification in this. So it should be very clear and to the market players that what is the plan for the electrification and energy efficiency projects in the building sector. So this means accelerating deep renovation of existing buildings, because deep renovation is linked to electrification. Also, it includes, first of all, lower energy consumption. So this is the opportunity for the more advanced technologies, but also building automation and measurement and controlling and energy management, which is very much relevant for the electrification. Then there is also an issue for the public funding and subsidies, which need to be rather clear. And as said here, you can see that if they are including external benefits of the project that's been implemented, then they also are very good for the electrification, because of course the emissions, the health, the warmth, the coolness of the buildings, everything else is supported or better in the case of electrification of the building. And then as last one and very important, the phase out of fossil fuels. You can see here that many new policies are supporting phase out of fossil fuels, meaning both phasing out the incentives, but also phasing out the installations. What needs to be done, and then again the same point, is trying to align it with the national policies, so that national building renovation plans also have the phase-out strategy, as is announced in the EU level policies. Then also that they are doing the local heating and cooling plans, national heating and cooling plans, and motivating local authorities to do the local cooling and heating plans, which would advance the electrification. Interesting point is also on the eco-design recast that could set standards for the heating and cooling equipment, which would mean also phasing out of fossil fuels. Regarding end users, they have been mentioned in the barrier section, the acceptance of the technologies, but this is relevant from several points. It's what Dario said, the not knowing the technology, being a kind of afraid of what the technology is going to bring, but also having a very long-term habits. Like this is especially interesting in the case of cooking, where there are certain habits that need to be changed with the electrification. So what we think are very relevant points in the narrative change for the end user is, for example, taking a very high into consideration the multiple benefits, as mentioned before. So doing the investment analysis, including all the aspects of life of this building, not only the energy consumption, but also everything that's related to and coming from energy consumption. Then there's doing a lot of good examples, and in this case there is a provision in EED giving the exemplary role of the public sector with renovation of buildings. But this could help a lot telling the citizens and the SMEs and the other energy users on the relevance of the energy efficiency. Then there is of course involvement, because acceptance is very much linked to involvement, but this means involving, as we said previously, the marketplace, but also involving the users in the policy design. Then there's also using a policy mix, and the National Energy and Climate Plans are great tools to use the policy mix, not to double count, not to do the double work, but to try to evaluate interactions between the policies and try to make them easier for the users, but also for the market. And then there's also a lot of monitoring and measurement needed, and information to citizens, and realistic information, which are partially defined by the Electricity Directive, but also giving them this opportunity to see the real results, either from their own measures implemented or from the measures in the similar kind of cases. Then there's also the natural advice, giving the opportunity to citizens to or to other energy users to have natural advice on the energy efficiency projects and electrification. And of course, there are some decisions that are not linked directly to energy, but are linked to other policies. For example, the problem that we are mostly familiar with, having the joint decisions in the apartment buildings, which should also be very much regulated to be able to modernize the building. Then there's also answering directly to the needs of the consumers, because, for example, what happens is that some policies are linked only to a certain consumer groups, and others don't have this good coming up from the policy implemented. And for example, we did a very nice study about the impacts of the new policies on the low-income groups. So the impacts on this group could be completely different than the impact of the other groups. So the distribution of this is very relevant. Also, the solutions that I mentioned for the private rented sector and incentives, as Dario mentioned, there are some situations when the policies are very well done, when the technology is very good, but the cabling on buildings and the technology already existent in the buildings just cannot follow on the new technology. So this is also so very important. Regarding the regulatory framework, so what is needed is to remove the market distortion. So the one that I mentioned already is the bureaucracy in the renewable energy implementation, but there are also some interesting things. For example, the way that energy is taxed. So it's taxed by its volume, but the new taxing directive should be taxing the energy based on its content and environmental performance. This is something that's already been done in, for example, Netherlands. Then, of course, when you get the electricity bill, what happens is that you get a lot of information about the costs, and it's not clear what comes from the, for example, from your consumption and what comes from other costs. So this is something that should be really, really clear, so that you are in a situation that you don't prefer other fuel to electricity because it's not clear from the bill that this is not the consumption. So also there are flexibility and the promotion of the demand side response and the dynamic grids. And also what is linked kind of to the bills is the possibility to compare the energy cost, the total expenditure, not only the price. So this includes also the life cycle costs. This includes also the investments and so on. So everything that's part of of your cost of energy. And as said several times, the externality of all energy prices. This here also returns me back to the emission trading scheme, which is at the revision at this point, and is very much relevant for electrification, because from now on the emissions will be traded also in the road transport and building sector, meaning gas from the buildings, for example, which is very much a benefit for the electrification. And last, but of course, everything but not the least, is the grid and network supporting everything that's done in the other parts of the electrification sector. So this means promoting investments on the electric grid and encasing flexibility of the grid, the most important part for what we want to do with the smart view on the electricity grid. So this means, for example, the aspects of the energy efficiency directive, directing energy efficiency and demand side response to be equally treated on the competing term with the generation, and very much focused on the energy efficiency first principle. That means installing energy efficiency measures and investments before adding any other generation of electricity or any other type of energy, which would very much help the electrification. Then there is promotion of alternative models for heat pumps, not only meaning the commonly used heat pumps in the buildings, but also, for example, micro district heating and cooling networks with renewable energy solutions, or an obligation to have a share of energy from renewable sources on the local level. And at the end, of course, mentioned a lot, the automation systems, the monitoring of the building consumption, the management in the building, the smartness of the building, which is, let's say, the final kind of goal of the electrification, which is very much promoted and very much needed and welcomed in the new Energy Performance of Buildings Directive. So in a kind of a summary, these are the things that we think are mostly needed for the advancement of electrification. So market research prior to policy development, meaning taking into consideration the possibility of the market to respond to a certain policy that's being implemented. Involving everyone, meaning involving from the side of the producers, installers, manufacturers, everyone that can ensure the supply, but also the relevant stakeholder from the consumption side. So changing habit is, as we said, one of the very relevant things in electrification. So using all the available information, meaning using also the financial resources and business models, which can be a major breakdown for the SMEs or the part of the households, the households that are in the lower income groups. Then, of course, everything that's promoted should be or can be sophisticated, but should remain simple for the use for the end users. Of course, as said, energy efficiency as a first fuel, energy efficiency as a source of energy security, and in combination with dynamic solution and advanced technologies. And what is, I mentioned a few times, so getting policies monitored, evaluated, so that it could be taken as a good example, followed up and accepted more by the users. And last thing that I also mentioned in several occasions is the fact that in some cases the EU framework is very pro energy efficiency and electrification, but the following up of the national framework is not so let's say active as the one on the EU level. So aligning it and implementing it would be one of the major issues in the policy recommendation. So thank you very much. Sorry, I'm speaking very fast because I want to tell you as many information as possible. There is a lot of content still in our study, and please, as Dario said, it's available as a handout here and also on the website of ERA. So please take it into consideration to take a look at it and let us know on your remarks and what else could be added. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Ivana, for being able to summarize all our findings in so short times. It wasn't easy, and we wanted to share with you what we found. That is mainly that we need a bunch of different policies to get the best results in the most cost-effective way, both at EU and at national level. And now it's the turn of Silvia Rizesi, that unfortunately can share the presentation from her laptop. So I will do it from mine. So Silvia, if you're here, you can turn everything on.
Yes. Good morning, everyone. Do you hear me well? Because I had a bunch of challenges joining via GoToMeeting.
Yes. Please proceed.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. My name is Silvia Rezici, and thank you for having me here today, and also for giving me the opportunity to listen in and for sharing the study, which I will further pass to colleagues. It's an extremely comprehensive and from what I've seen, really very well done piece of work. I would try to, I work at DG Energy. I am part of the unit dealing with buildings and products. So my colleagues and I are working on the EPBD, but also on eco design and energy labeling. And today I will try to give you a very short overview of some of the more conductive provisions of our EPBD legislative proposal, conductive in the context of electrification of buildings. Of course, I do believe that actually our proposal aspires to deliver a number of the policy recommendations directed to regulation that were spelled out in the presentation of Ivana, which was extremely interesting. And of course, I'm happy to to enforce the message that indeed final success, what will come out, regulation is not an aim in itself. Be it whatever legal format it takes, a directive, a regulation, a decision, whatever format it takes. Its final success really depends, first of all, in our case, as you know, the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive is currently in the legislative proposal, so the final outcome of the negotiations between the co-legislators, but also on the implementation and commitment by all stakeholders involved in really deploying the policy on the ground, be it national, regional, local authorities, the industries, and very importantly, engaging citizens. Next slide, please. So a few words. I don't see the slides changing. Okay, now I do. A few words on the Fit for 55 package and the role of buildings. As you know, it's a set of interconnected proposals that aim to strike a balance between tools, building on pricing, on standards, and on support measures in view of achieving our energy and climate targets. Of course, beyond the decarbonization agenda, making our homes and our buildings fit for greener future deploys a number of multiple co-benefits, which very often are very tricky and very difficult to quantify, which should not discourage us or you. And here on this slide, I have just shared with you a graph showing the added value of the EPBD within the complete set of delivering on the Green Deal proposal, so the Fit for 55 legislative and policy package. Basically, the difference between the red dotted line and the green dotted line is what the EPBD revision aspires to contribute and will contribute in the context of achieving our decarbonization targets. Next slide, please. I will come back to the EPBD just in a moment. I would like to spend a few minutes on the Repower communication and plan. As you know, in all likelihood, the core objective of the Repower EU is to reduce our reliance on Russian fossil fuels in general, and in particular on natural gas. 55% of which natural gas is consumed by buildings, mostly for heating. Indeed, Repower places a very strong focus on energy efficiency, heat pumps, solar energy. For example, it includes legislative proposals that have been taken further in the legislative process to raise the EU targets for renewable energy to 45% in the RED II directive instead of 40%. and the energy efficiency target to 13% saving instead of 9%. It also points to the need to increase the share of renewables powering buildings to 60% by 2030. The Repower plan further includes also measures to boost renewables, including solar. For sure, you have by now seen presentations on the EU solar energy strategy, on the new, in the context of the EPBD proposal, the new solar rooftop initiative with a phased-in legal obligation to install rooftop solar energy on all new public and commercial buildings and new residential buildings from 2026, and a target to double the deployment rate in the context of Repower EU, the deployment rate of heat pumps, and reach 10 million units within the following 5 years and 30 million units by 2030. Which also means there is a need to further tighten restrictions for fossil fuel boilers and the phase out obligation that is the phase out planning that is often referred to. Next slide, please. I will spend now a bit of time on the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive and the one after, please. As you know, it is part of the Fit for 55 proposals. It was adopted almost a year ago. The Commission proposal was adopted a year ago in December 21. Just very recently, on 25th of October, the Council adopted the so-called general approach. I have included a link in my presentation, which is the general approach is the negotiating mandate of the Council. That negotiating mandate was adopted with broad support, but still remaining different and sometimes rather opposing views on important provisions. On the side of the Parliament, the ITRE vote, the committee vote, is expected at the end of January 2023, following which with a tacit agreement or plenary vote in February, both co-legislators would have their negotiating mandates, and the trialogues would be in a position to start. Next slide, please. I have tried here. We can skip this one, even though it's important, but I don't want to eat up from the time for discussion and the following speakers. The objectives of the EPBD are well known, contributing to reducing greenhouse gas emissions and final energy consumption, and establishing a long-term vision for buildings. We work in 4, let's say, major focus areas with corresponding and interconnected measures under each of those. So renovation, decarbonization, modernization, and system integration and financing. I will, in the next few slides, I will try to pick the most relevant provisions from the EPBD with significance in the context of the electrification of buildings. Of course, this is not a extremely comprehensive, doesn't aspire to be a very comprehensive exercise, but still I would like to draw your attention to those. Next slide, please. And as previous speakers, I invite you to get more of the information-rich points included on the slides. I start with the caveat that the EPBD is a technology-neutral policy tool rather than a vehicle to promote a certain technological choice. Nevertheless, a number of the provisions in the directive do provide ground for fertile ground for electrification of buildings, including the zero emission building definition, the definition of deep renovation, and higher financing for deep renovation, the minimum energy performance standards, and financial incentives, including, for instance, no public support for fossil fuels as from 2027, which the Repower plan has advanced to 2025, and a clear legal basis for national bans, as well as the smart readiness indicator. I have not included in this slide also other provisions related to of importance for electrifications related to, for instance, EPC certificates, as well as electric vehicles, so electromobility provisions under Article 12, which strictly speaking are not building electrification, but still provide the flexibility, balancing, and can provide the flexibility, balancing, and storage services, especially through aggregation. Next slide, please. When it comes to zero emission buildings, you know probably that the EPBD revision includes a new definition of zero emission building, which is a building with a very high energy performance in line with the energy efficiency first principle, and it's very important to emphasize, and where the very low amount of energy still required is fully covered by energy from renewable sources at the building or district or community level. Zero emission buildings, the Commission proposal aspire to become the new standard for new buildings, and the level to be attained by a deep renovation as of 2030, and indeed the vision for the building stock in 2050. Now, for those of you who might have embarked on reading through the general approach of the Council, there are certain changes that member states see fit to ask for. But the important thing is the zero emission, the zero carbon emission on site stays as part of the Council negotiating position, and then of course we will see what will come next in the legislative process. Next slide, please. When it comes to minimum energy performance standards, this is a key feature of this policy tool is to trigger renovation and introduce union-wide standard that aims to phase out worst performing buildings. I have put the timelines, EPC class F by 2027, and class E by 2030 for public and other non-residential buildings, and EPC class F by 2030 and E by 2033 for residential buildings. This is the proposal of the Commission. It also introduces rescaling of energy performance certificates with G class corresponding to the 15% worst performing buildings at national level, and A class being a zero emission building. In this context, it's very important, and I'm happy that Ivana, you mentioned this, the integrated planning basically. So member states are to plan further improvement of their building stock in building renovation plans. We have introduced a template for those. I do believe it offers a very comprehensive coverage. For instance, also the skills dimension that was already part of the long-term renovation strategies, but again is flagged. In this context, it's worth mentioning also that our proposal introduces a supporting framework with a focus on financing, and very importantly, financing for vulnerable people, and monitoring vulnerable and monitoring the social impact of minimum energy performance standards, as very often we hear the argument that this is going to cost a lot, and the distributional impact of those. Well, just to put this in a perspective, I have a couple of days ago read an analysis of a stakeholder, a prominent analytical stakeholder, that says that since the start of the energy crisis in, say, autumn 2021, 674 billion euro has been allocated and earmarked across European countries to shield consumers from rising energy costs. And this is indeed this is something that is important, but as an order of magnitude, this is an amount that is very close to our estimate of the cost of the maps in the impact assessment. Next slide, please. Then we have the deep renovation, the definition of a deep renovation, which we aspire to become a gold standard for building renovation, meaning a building renovation which transforms a building or a building unit before 2030 into nearly zero energy building, and as from 2030 into a zero emission building. It is not a mandatory provision, but member states shall provide higher support for deep renovation and for large-scale programs resulting in at least 30% energy saving. And I have 3 more slides, so bear with me. Next slide, please. Financial incentives and market barriers. This is important in the context of really looking at the delivery of the obligations and provisions in a more holistic and integrated manner. We have a clear obligation for member states to provide appropriate financing and to support measures and stimulate private investment in line with the building renovation plans. We also have a provision on the removal of non-economic barriers to building renovation, on cost-effective use of available financing, and the promotion of rollout of enabling funding and financial tools. This is Article 15, paragraph 4. Next slide, please. Other important provisions include member states ensuring that energy efficiency lending products ensuring the availability or the offer, the wide offer and non-discriminatory offer of energy efficiency lending products for building renovations, so mortgages and loans. We have a provision in the financing article on technical assistance, and also measures to ensure sufficient workforce and skills. We importantly, as I mentioned already, no financial incentives for fossil fuel boilers as from 2027, which the Repower plan recommends to advancing to 2025. In the context of encouraging reduction of subsidies to support schemes for heat pumps. We have 2 paragraphs, one on focus of financial support for vulnerable households, and one in the context of split incentives, so benefiting both owners and tenants. Now, my last slide, can you please move to the last slide? Now, these were the some major provisions. Again, I did not have time to go on provisions related to the smart readiness indicator that is very important, energy performance certificates, and other from our directive, but also there are other very important ongoing pieces of legislative work in the pipeline. As you know, the eco-design revision for space heaters and water heaters, and our ongoing work, colleagues in my unit, on a unified energy label that will allow citizens to compare across different space and water heating technologies. Already last September 2021, my colleagues had a very comprehensive stakeholder event. So I guess many of you here are quite aware of what is going on this front. My colleagues are working now on finalizing the impact assessment before moving forward. As you know, also just a couple of weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, in the beginning of November, the Commission adopted a proposal for a Council regulation on a framework to accelerate the deployment of renewable energy, which has important provisions for heat pump deployment, namely accelerating heat pump deployment in all sectors by supporting simplified permitting for small heat pumps, 12 kilowatts and up to 50 if there is an offsetting renewable electricity self-consumption capacity that is at least 60% of the electric heat pump capacity. And also in this regulation or proposal for regulation, there is a provision to setting short deadlines for permitting of large heat pumps, such as ground source heat pumps designed for district heating and cooling in industrial applications. You also quite likely know of the ongoing work in the context of the Energy Tax Directive, and which introduces a new structure of tax rate based on the energy content and the environmental performance of the fuels and electricity, and which also broadens the taxable base by including more products in the scope. And by removing some of the current exemptions and reductions. Just for the minimum rates are quite favorable in this context for electricity, and that should be mentioned. And of course, I look forward now for the discussion that follows, as there are other important bits and pieces of this puzzle of electrifying our buildings related to market design, environmental taxation, network regulation, really allowing demand flexibility, and others. So thank you. It's a bit lonely to be on your phone because I don't see I don't see very well, but so if there are questions in a chat or I don't know
okay,
how Dario you take it further. Thank you.
No, thank you very much, Silvia, both for being with us despite the complications, and because you offered us a very interesting and effective summary of all the work that the European Commission and DG ENER has done within the Fit for 55 packages, and in particular with the EPBD directive, because of course there has been time only to speak about that with the focus on the electrification. So there is a lot of work to do. There is also a lot of work for the main stakeholders to try to facilitate the best outcome from the trilogue that will discuss all these directives and all the packages in the next weeks and months, as Silvia mentioned during her presentation. Now, I think it's time. I remind the audience that they can ask whatever they want through the questions tab on the control panel, so that our panelists can give you some information or some hints on your doubts, on your suggestions. And now I ask our panelists to activate their webcams and come here on stage, even if it's a virtual stage. And by the way, I wish to thank all the stakeholders that contributed to our study with interviews and sharing their views. Was very important for us to enlarging our vision and improving our proposals. I'd like to start with Monica Frazzoni, who I can't see at the moment, but she was with us previously. Monica, I can see you. Well, she got a little distracted, maybe. Let's try to reach her, because Monica has an issue, a family issue, so she has to leave early. So I try to.
Here I am.
Ah, here you are. Perfect.
Sorry, I was just desperately trying to find the button.
Yes, it's part of a simplification that is part of our
yes. No, but I'm sorry, but it's always how to say, I wouldn't say complicated, but can you see me? No, you can't see me. No. Now you can see me.
Now we can.
There you go. Okay, so can I start? Everybody hears me? Yes, thank you very much. I want to underline a couple of things in premise. First, the importance of this kind of studies, because when we are talking about energy efficiency, there is constantly an underestimation, a lack of knowledge, a lack of sensitivity to how much we can reach in terms of decarbonization by implementing good regulations, which as we heard, are still in the making, and with a good implementation capacity, which, as Dario also explained, and the study extensively explained, depend from a lot of things. And this is probably what makes the agenda of energy efficiency more complicated than others, because we need many stakeholders, many actors which are active on different issues, that, as you, Dario, said, the technological, the political, the even behavioral, and of course the legislative. And so these kind of studies are important because they provide data that can be used, and since everybody is basically running after diversification in terms of supply, and in some cases diversification in the same, let's say, fossil environment that we are still too much dependent from, this kind of studies help us to indicate, let's say, the right solution, because as we all know, in the building sector, we need to reach 60% diminution of greenhouse gases and a zero by 2050. And I think that the challenge is not, like most challenges actually concerning climate, are probably not as clear to everyone as we would like. We also did some time ago a study, and Daniele was involved in this, that is very much complementary with your conclusions, what was done by Cambridge Econometric and the European Alliance to Save Energy, and that was released in March, which assessed the socio-economic impacts of different scenarios to reach zero emission. And of course, you will not be particularly surprised in discovering that the large electrification, the use limited of green hydrogen, and a mix of both in the individual heating system came as, let's say, very important and very effective. With the idea, though, that when we are speaking about green hydrogen, we are speaking about solutions that will not be up and running in every quarter, let's say, as we wish. And in any case, we are absolutely convinced that in terms of effectiveness, the use of green hydrogen should, at least for the next decades, be limited to hard to abate sectors, probably big ships, etc., but certainly not to put it in your home heating. Also, the study, but which goes very much, as I said, in the direction of what you just said, we're also calculating the impact of a low and high annual energy renovation rate. Now, we know that this is probably the most thorny question. That is to say, the capacity of improving the renovation level. In Italy, as you all know, the renovation rate in 1 year is less actually than 1%, whereas it should be 3%. And of course, this is a massive challenge. And we saw that the difference between a moment in which we have more or less 1.5% renovation rate and 3.5% is absolutely massive. We are talking about 1.2 million net additional jobs. We would spend less 43 billion euros a year on gas imports. At the moment, we are about 155 billion of cubic meters of import of gas every year, and we would have cheaper heating bills, etc. So what I wanted to underline is the fact that by now the argument of things being expensive is less convincing, but on the other hand, we are still having to face what are two actually basic problems. One is the integration, a much better integration, and you also said it in your introduction, of renewables with energy efficiency techniques, which is really extremely important, because this is the way through which we can actually achieve what we want, and also we can integrate sectors that were till recently in silos. You know, the energy efficiency is the management and renewables is supply. And the fact of putting them together in a much more convincing way is absolutely key. We also are working as the European Alliance of Energy, as you may imagine, around the questions of around the legislation. We are very worried, actually, to be frank, because the noises that we hear from the member states are negative, both on ED and EPBD, even more on EPBD, and because in terms of targets, but also in terms of capacity of member states to accept obligations that are deriving from these directives in order to make their plans more effective, because they are all behind schedule, basically. The issue of how important and how relevant the legislation will be is there. Because if you do a legislation which is too flexible or too weak, then every member state will do according to its political approach, more or less. And this is certainly something that is not at all welcome. Just a few comments, very shortly, on some of the points that we are particularly worried about, beside the question of the targets in the EED. We consider that in the EPBD, the real campaign, which is now done, and I'm sure it will be even more strong during the trilogues or during the agreements, during the period of the negotiations, against the MEPs, the minimum energy performance standards, is worrying, because the effort of taking away all kinds of binding, of bindingness, and an addition of these MEPs is one of the things that will probably make, if successful, this legislation relatively irrelevant. And also the limitation of the scope of the MEPs only to worst performing buildings is something that we consider to be unsatisfactory, and also something that will have a negative impact, because take into account that when people try or decide to renew their houses, it's not that they do it 2 years after because the technology becomes better. It's and I have it myself in this big building where I live. We made a big change 5 years, not more than that, 8 years ago, and now, of course, even if it is a system that is much more effective than before, it is still based on fossil fuel. So I think that we really need to give a decisive push to avoid that gas, or in any case fossil fuels, can be considered conducive to more efficiency. This is something that is extremely strongly there, and is probably one of the political points that political and legislative point that we have to get rid. Last but not least, in the UE's website, you will find a sort of catalog that we did with our companies and with some experts of comparison, which we think is quite important, of how much gas you could save if, for example, you would have LED in all public illumination, public lighting in Europe, or if you would have, the valves, the thermostatic valves, or other solutions. There are many of them, and this is of course of approximate calculation, but this gives you the scale that is needed in order to give this massive priority to energy efficiency that we see in the discourse and in pushing the individual behavior, but we don't see it so much in appetite for stronger measures. And this is certainly something that also in the legislation ahead will be absolutely worrying. I stop here. I will, unfortunately, have to leave in 5 minutes. It's not my habit to do this kind of things, but such is life. Sometimes it happens also to me. Thank you so much, and thank you for the study as well.
Thank you very much, Monica, for your energy, and you raised very important points that I think will also animate our discussion. Particularly the complicated moment we are living. We don't have any more negationism of global warming, but we have over narratives that hampers what we really have to achieve to, let's say, overcome the challenges we have, the real challenges. So we have to work, everybody, to try to solve in the right way this issue. Sam, RAP is working with policy to try to enhance them, to get the most out of them, to reach our targets. What's your view on the present situation in terms of policies and discussion at the trilogue level, and also in terms of what we propose in our study?
Thank you, Dario. Can I just check you can see me okay?
Yeah, perfect.
Excellent, right. And obviously you can hear me. So, well, look, thank you for the study. I thought it was very comprehensive and really chimes a lot with the work that we do in RAP as well. In fact, we've just released our own heat pump policy toolkit, which is, more narrowly focused just on heat pumps as opposed to building electrification more generally. But it identifies a number of the same themes. And it was interesting actually to see Sylvia's presentation when she showed the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the building stock. And there was quite a big fall about 10, 15 years ago that really coincided with the efficiency improvements in gas boilers. So when condensing boilers really basically flooded the market and replaced the very inefficient old boilers. And I think with heat pumps and electrification of space heating, and you rightly identified that as the main energy use that will reduce emissions in the building sector, I think we're going to see the same thing again. And with the current energy crisis, we are seeing electrification of heat, those marketplaces already expanding massively in many countries. So I think actually things are looking positive for electrification of heat, but there are still things that many things that policy needs to do to ensure that that can be widespread across European markets and that it can be sustained over the coming decades. And I think you identified very clearly the barriers and the kind of the policy areas that need to be addressed. In RAP, I'd say we kind of highlight 3 key pillars. So one would be the economics, getting that right. And Ivana mentioned energy pricing. Clearly, electricity is overtaxed compared to the fuels it's competing against. Carbon pricing, the ETS, affects electricity, and indeed district heating systems with large installations. Then there are the way in which levies affect energy prices. So the levies that help to fund solar panels, for example, feed-in tariffs, those tend to almost all fall on electricity. And that may have made sense a few years ago, but it's kind of crazy now when we want people to switch from fossil fuels to electricity, which is becoming increasingly decarbonized. And if we don't rebalance that policy cost between fuels, we're essentially shooting ourselves in the foot. It makes the other elements of the policy framework more difficult to put in place. You can't necessarily write regulation, let alone enforce it, if you're setting up the economics in a way that mitigates against switching. And similarly, if you have subsidy regimes from public budgets that are required to overcome some of the higher upfront costs, or to provide subsidies to low-income households that Ivana also mentioned, those need to be higher if the payback is longer and more tricky to get because you're taxing electricity or putting levies on electricity in a disproportionate way. So getting the economics right is really crucial. The second one is around regulation, that was also mentioned in everything we've heard so far. The private sector to invest needs as much certainty as it can get, at least predictability. And the things like bans on fossil fuel boilers at a date at some point in the future are clearly very helpful in giving a signal to the market, and we're seeing that coming in many countries, and potential proposal within the eco design by the end of the decade. And then building regulations as well, as we've heard a lot about the EPBD. At the national level, I think there are opportunities to make building regulations not necessarily technology partial, but very clear about at least the minimum level you need to get your building to, some kind of low flow temperature standard. So a building that is suitable for electrification would be helpful for the industry if it was brought in at the national level. And then I guess the third leg in, or the third pillar in our Roman temple, let's call it, would be the subsidy programs, which are clearly still needed to overcome those high upfront costs. The low cost finance regimes that Ivana mentioned. And then also to support training and consumer awareness campaigns. Consumers are being asked to switch to technologies that are unfamiliar in many cases, and will cause them to be nervous about wanting to switch. The industry, I mean, I think if you can get the economics right and the regulatory certainty right, the industry will train up the workforce that's required. But at the same time, the Repower EU element of this means we need to accelerate even faster than we thought before. So there's clearly a role for government there to pump prime training and capacity building within the installation industry, and also within the kind of get the digitalization aspect of skills improved. And we see that it's kind of mentioned in the EU skills strategy. If we really want to accelerate heat pump adoption, then you might want to go beyond those kind of three classic pillars. We've been looking into essentially obligations on utilities. So we see that widely within Europe for energy efficiency already. Those EEOs could have ring-fence sub-targets for electrification of heat, potentially, to kind of basically give the industry even more certainty about the trajectory to some endpoint at which a ban or some regulation would come into force. So we feel that there might be some kind of role for an obligation to provide a quantity-based instrument that would give the industry even more certainty if you want to drive that trajectory, accelerated trajectory towards an end goal. And then finally, thinking about the EU directives themselves and the Renewable Energy Directive, the heating and cooling target, the way in which that's specified is not super helpful for electrification. So if it's specified it's basically specified in terms of the renewable share of overall heating and cooling energy, but it's the inputs that count. So a 50% efficient furnace that's burning biomass would basically count for twice as much as a heat pump that's delivering the heat to that building at a much more in a much more efficient way. And then secondly, you need to be able to count the electricity that's used in heat pumps towards that heating and cooling target. So there are some very specific things one can do to the Renewable Energy Directive heating and cooling target that could improve the European environment for heat pump acceleration, and would then feed through to the incentives facing member states when they're designing their policy frameworks. So I'll stop there, Dario, and very interested to hear from our other speakers. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Sam, also for highlighting this link between statistics, let's say so, and policies and the effects they can have on pushing more or less some technologies. And coming to the link between technologies, electrification technologies and policies, let's start with Josephine from the European Heat Pump Associations. So what is the EPA's view on the policies needed to reach the target, and how can we accelerate the development of the supply? You spoke quite clearly in your proposal of the need of an accelerator to try to reach the targets we have in front of us. Please, Josephine.
Yeah. Indeed, thank you, Dario. And thank you for inviting us to this panel and for this very comprehensive study. I think you really covered all areas that are affected. It's really, really impressive. I'm really also looking forward to dive into the details of the study. I have looked at the summary so far, but I think it will be also very helpful for our future work, so thanks for that. And one of the main conclusions that was also taken is this link between the EU level and then the national translation, so in the NECPs. And that's also something we are working on. So we have among our members not only component manufacturers and heat pump manufacturers and utilities, but also research institutes and also national associations. And with them, we are really trying to indeed make that link between EU level policies and then how it's translated at national level. And what you indicated indeed is the huge potential for heat pumps. So we saw in 2021 an increase of 34% of heat pump sales, but to put this in perspective, this was only 21% of the total heater sales. So you see there's still really a huge potential to increase. And we feel, or yeah, we notice in a lot of things that this year, really 2022 is really the tipping point for our sector. And that's really, yeah, majorly thanks to the Repower EU document that states indeed is very ambitious heat pump targets, as Sylvia mentioned, doubling annual sales to reach 10 million heat pumps by 2025 and 30 million heat pumps by 2030. But the Commission only refers to hydronic heat pumps. And what we really want to stress is that you need to extrapolate this to the whole heat pump sector, because you also need air-to-air heat pumps to achieve our energy and climate targets and reduce our dependency on Russian fossil fuels, because also air-to-air heat pumps replace fossil fuel boilers, of course. So this is very important. And actually, then you see a number of 60 million heat pumps by 2030, which is actually a quadrupling of the current heat pump stock in 8 years. So this is a huge challenge. This is really, yeah, a very big challenge. And we see what is lacking now to achieve that is, yeah, so first of all, we had these numbers in the Repower EU target, and we had some measures proposed, but we are lacking an overall comprehensive view on this, which we would call the heat pump accelerator, because you have a hydrogen accelerator, you have a battery alliance, you have a solar strategy. But for this key technology that is, yeah, has to increase so much in the upcoming years, we really see that an overall incentive is needed as well, so a heat pump accelerator. And there, yeah, this was, as Sam also mentioned, this would give also certainty, long-term certainty and predictability to the sector that this technology is not the technology of the future, but already of today, and that is here to stay, and that investments should clearly shift from fossil fuel boilers to heat pumps. So that's a key point for us. And we look a bit at the example of Germany, where you have really this heat pump summits, where you have the government that sits together. There have been 2 or 3 by now, with the sector, with the sector associations, with manufacturers, with installers, with other stakeholders, to really look at what is now lacking to achieve these targets. They look at what are the current market numbers, which, for example, trainings are lacking, which subsidy schemes are necessary, which other investments are necessary, and they really sit together and take stock on a regular basis of this. So that's what we call for as well at the EU level. And then the policies they should look at are, I'm going to repeat some of the things that Sam has mentioned, of course, and also in the study, of course, this economics aspect. Clean heating should be affordable. That's really key. This shifting taxes and levies, as was clearly explained by Sam, it's really a key aspect, because indeed, even though if you have a lot of other regulatory measures, as long as the economics do not make sense, it's of course very hard to convince people to invest in something. So yeah, this is one key point. A second one for us that is very important is that policies in general should support this large-scale rollout and not slow it down. And then specifically we refer to the F-gas regulation and to eco-design, where, for example, on eco-design, there's a lot of regulation and testing and so on required for heat pumps, which is often much more than on fossil fuel boilers. So we should take into account that this is not made more complicated for heat pumps than for fossil fuel boilers. And on the F-gas regulation, of course, also there we have to take into account this large-scale rollout, where we need to increase the heat pumps, quadruple the heat pumps in the next 8 years, and make this compatible with the F-gas phase down that is proposed. So that's the second point. And then a third point that has been also mentioned are, of course, the skills. Even if you have an increased demand, if you have an increased supply, you still need people to not only install them, because of course installers are needed, but also, for example, people at municipalities who deal with the subsidies, they should also know about the technology. Architects, for example, I have a personal experience as well with renovating a house with a heat pump where the architect was not supporting this at all. So there's also training and formation needed. So all these type of skills should be addressed. I propose I stop here and give the floor to the others as well.
Thank you, Josephine. I will come back later with some other questions on these points. Simone, you deal with another important electrification technology, which is building automation and all what can make our buildings more clever and go within the proposal of Commission about the intelligent indicators of buildings. So what's the view of UBAC on the policy needed to overcome the barriers we face?
Thank you very much, Dario, for inviting UBAC, but also for the study. Very interesting, and glad to see that the role of smart technologies such as BACs were a part of the scope. So let me start with a comment on the slides before. I saw one that was mentioning the energy consumption that the BACs are adding. It's probably worth mentioning that there was an eco-design study, a preparatory study done by Vito on this field. And the finding of the study was that the consumption of these technologies is actually negligible. I'm quoting the study here compared to the savings that they are achieving. So I think it's an important remark in this case. And I'm also glad to see that in the study there were some of the numbers in terms of the savings that these technologies can achieve. So according to EN and ISO standards, the international standards, the BACs can deliver up to 52% thermal and electrical savings, depending on the type of building, depending if it's an office, retail, and so on and so forth. That being said, I think in terms of the obstacles, I also found the ones that are listed in the study very interesting, and I completely agree with some of them. So split incentives dilemma, adequate financing, and lack of skilled professionals, as mentioned by the other ones. But I would also like to, as you were asking, highlight some of the main, in short, some of the most important policies that we believe are needed. The first one is a bit peculiar, and it's about the importance of implementing existing policies. Because, for example, the latest EPBD, the one that is currently being implemented by the member states, it already includes certain measures. So, for example, when it comes to BACS, split incentives was already an issue. The Commission acknowledged that, and there are, as mentioned in the previous presentation, some requirements for large non-residential buildings by 2025 to be equipped with certain BACS capabilities. Now, these measures need to be transposed first and then implemented. Thanks to our monitoring activities, we know that even 3 years after the deadline for transposition, many member states still didn't implement these measures. And if you think that they didn't transpose the measures, it means that even the implementation will be harder and harder and probably not timely. If you add the lack of skilled professional to this, then you might see that some of the figures that we have when it comes to the path that we are in terms of achieving the objectives that we have as European Union, they might not be real, because these are based on estimations of policies that are actually not being implemented. So I think this is really important, and in the EU, in Brussels, we should all pay more and more attention towards what's happening in the countries. The second point is I agree with the fact that we should accelerate the rate of renovations, and I fully support the maps in the framework of the EPBD revision. I think in this regard, I would like to say that I appreciate the technology neutrality in the approach of the Commission, and even here we should pay attention of the fact that there should be equal attention, not only to the envelope but also to the technology, to the active control of energy usage, for example, because I mean they're both pillars that are complementary to each other, and they're both important. So, for example, when we talk about deep renovation, we prefer to talk about stage deep renovation instead of deep renovation alone. Why? Also because we believe that certain cost-effective technologies, such as BACS, for example, the payback time is 3 to 5 years. So if you see this short payback time, it's clear to see that if you invest first in these technologies that can deliver quite some energy savings, then you will, in those 5 years, you will get the savings that then you can use for other interventions. Another important data is the returns from the investments in BACS are 9 times higher than the initial cost. So this gives you an idea. And last but not least, so you mentioned the smart readiness indicator. So this is an indicator that is very important. Even this one is already in the previous EPBD. It is only a voluntary measure right now, and we believe that it will be really important as a signal to the market as well, if the next EPBD would make it mandatory, at least for large non-residential buildings. Only in this way, we believe that the end users would understand the value of this tool. This tool will start really achieving its mission when it comes to giving more value to the investments that are done in this sector, and also showing the occupants potentially also what is needed, the potential improvement. These, together with, of course, many other requirements that involves, for example, building automation, hydronic balancing, and so on and so forth. So I think I can end it up here as well, so that I give enough time to Quintana and Daniele. But thank you very much again for the time and for your attention.
Thank you, Simone. And by the way, in the study we highlighted the importance of technology neutrality, because we need it for many reasons. But on the other hand, we also need to push the right technologies. especially when we speak about incentives and other policies. They need to push what really change our energy system and the emissions factors of our building stocks, and we really believe that. Quentin, we've spoken of many technologies, maybe something we don't consider many times is what is inside our buildings in terms of cabling and other things, which is nevertheless important. What's the view of your association with electrification and the needed policy?
Thank you, Dario, and thank you for the invitation and for the study that is indeed really interesting. So first, I can only agree with all what has been said by the others. So we know the key role of electrification for heating. So we will need heat pump, we will need bags, we will need electrification for transport with e-mobility, so recharging points in buildings, solar power on rooftops to generate electricity. Maybe we will have batteries in buildings to store electricity. So a lot will rely on electrification to bring buildings to zero emission buildings. And then a key element that is often a bit forgotten, overlooked in this picture, and that is connecting all the elements that you have mentioned, is simply the electrical installation in the building. And I'm pleased that it was mentioned into your study, actually not in the summary, but in the full study it's mentioned, that we need to make sure that the electrical installation is ready for this in the building. So the electrical installations, they must simply be safe, they must be efficient, they must be smart, and they must be future ready. So for the next step of electrification that will come. And when we look at this now in the residential building sector, we know that more or less half of the dwellings, they have obsolete electrical installations, meaning that they were done more than 30 years ago and not upgraded since then. And if you think about an electrical installation of 30 years ago in a dwelling, it was done for a few lighting bulbs, maybe with the main use of electricity being your electric kettle or your iron. So with peak of demand of 1.5 to 2 kilowatts. And now with the evolution of time, people have more and more electric devices using more and more power. Then there is also an aging of the electrical installation. And then when you come with the idea that you should electrify cooking, so with simply electric hobs, induction hobs in your kitchen, this is already more than 3 kilowatt that can be used there. If you come with an EV charging point that can be 3, 7, or 11 kilowatts in your house, you come with the heat pump that will also be several kilowatts. So all of this is quite a challenge for the electrical installation, which means that when you have a deep renovation of a building to integrate all of this, usually you will upgrade the electrical installation. But that's where we need to make sure that it is done and that it will anticipate the next steps. Because I can speak about my situation where I have a house that has been renovated less than 10 years ago, so it's already Class B, it's very good for everything. I still have a gas boiler, unfortunately, and when I installed the EV charging point recently, the person came and had to add a new switchboard for the recharging point, and then I asked to the installer, I said, and the day I will want to put a heat pump, what will be needed on the electrical installation? He said, oh, that's a pity, you will have to put another switchboard, and actually I could have brought a bigger switchboard directly today to anticipate this, but I don't have it with me. Luckily you have space enough, but at the end it will look like a patchwork because you had elements, while it would be much easier to just anticipate this. So that's some of the elements that are important for the electrical installation. And then when we think about policy, the EPBD can do something for it. In the proposal of the Commission, it was a bit lacking, but in the Parliament, there is now a strong support to consider the electrical installation as a technical building system, which is then very important for all what is in the EPBD, that can allow us also to have inspection of the electrical installation, to know what is the status of it. So it's usually well implemented into non-residential building that for safety reason you have regularly inspection of electrical installations. It's not systematically the case in dwellings. So that's something that could be improved. And then the status of the electrical installation is something that could be communicated into the energy performance certificate, so that you know also what is the readiness to add major electrical equipment. So when I was investigating what was the possibility to install an EV charging point in my house, no information on this into the energy performance certificate. Actually, also not the information into my electrical installation inspection report that I had. So I had to call the electricity distribution company to get the information, to check things. So that's not easy. So this information should be easily accessible. Also within all the tools that the EPBD propose, such as one-stop shop or building renovation passport, we should make sure that this aspect of the electrical installation is well considered. So it's not rocket science, it's not a huge technical barrier to upgrade an electrical installation. But if you don't have the information, if you don't provide this easily, and if you don't anticipate the future, then you may create hurdles. And we often look or think about the electricity grid that may require some upgrade in some places, but the electrical installation in the building is also important. And finally, I would like to mention that it's also important for energy efficiency as such, because today 2% of the electricity generated in the EU is lost within the in-building electrical installations. So that's something that has been investigated by the Commission as part of a preparatory study for eco-design of cables to see what can we do to save more or reduce these losses. So the potential is to divide these losses by 2 by addressing the efficiency of the electrical installation into non-residential buildings. But obviously, eco-design is not the right tool for it, because you cannot put an eco-design requirement on the cable. You need to design the full installation to be efficient, and it depends on the loads, etc., to optimize this. And so that's where, again, as part of the energy efficiency optimization of a building, which is mandated by the EPBD, you could look at optimizing the efficiency of the electrical installation as such, particularly in bigger buildings with bigger loads, to make sure that you reduce these losses. It's also something, if you charge your EV at home and you feel the temperature of the cable, you can just feel these losses and say, oh, this could maybe be optimized. That's also experience you can have. So in a nutshell, I really welcome your study, and these references to electrical installation that are important. And I think more should be done on this in the policies as well, including in the EPBD. It was a bit missing in the proposal of the Commission, but the Parliament is coming with good proposals, particularly in the opinion in ENVI, to have this electrical installation as technical building system, to have their status into the energy performance certificate, and to have regular inspections of the electrical installation. And I think that that's really positive for all what you have discussed before about electrification of buildings.
Thank you very much, Quentin, for highlighting this important point that is not in our executive summary, but is in the study, and we think it's very important because also because sometimes it's neglected. Maybe we can add something in the executive summary, because one of the advantages of making digital reports is that we can improve them, and of course this is an invitation also to the audience. If you have remarks after reading the reports, please let us know. There is space for improvements. Daniele, we have spoken of buildings, the technologies to put inside buildings, the importance of producing the electricity we need for this electrification process. But of course, there is a very important role for grids, and grids underwent a very important transformation in the last 2 decades. If I think that in the late 90s I was studying engineering, and we face very different grids, monodirectional, quite passive, incapable of accepting a high percentage of non-programmable power plants. Now it's everything very different, and we need to move even more forward. What's the view of from Euroelectric on these points?
Yes, thank you, Dario, and thank you for this. This panel is a very interesting one. And again, I chair the Electrification and Sustainability Committee of Euroelectric, and we're obviously, looking, reviewing, analyzing, interacting with stakeholders on this revolution Infrastructure often comes up. People say, well, all the grid's going to be able to deal with the increased demand. Now, I would say, 10 years ago, probably not. But today, the way we're proceeding in Europe, we are very optimistic. We're optimistic because it is true that electrification is increasing electricity demand, but it's also true that energy efficiency is also reducing it. So often the net impact is not as high as people think. The other reason for which we're optimistic is also because digitalization and parts of what Simone was mentioning earlier is going to help manage the loads, make sure that the demand meets supply of the intermittent renewables. And so in that sense, buildings do play a very important role because with their thermal inertia, they can provide some very important response measures. We really enjoyed reading the study and exploring with FIR and IECP, which I thank again for a wonderful study, because it really brings out the fact that buildings are going to be the hub of the future. They're the hub because they really lie at the intersection between the building, the transport, and the power sector, providing services, very useful services to the power sector in terms of flexibility, to the transport in terms of recharging. They're going to be the hub also because they're very complex. Internet of Things, again, Simone, I go back to what you were mentioning, and I think the potential there is very interesting, and more visibility should be given to the fact that digitalization will help bring a lot more benefits that go way beyond decarbonization. They're hubs also because buildings are very densely populated by actors. You have utilities, you have contractors, you have the people who do the maintenance, you have the users. And so in that sense, it is very important that you have all these different stakeholders interacting among themselves. And that's why also as Eurelectric, we recently launched this platform a month ago, Power to Buildings, where we really bring together all the different stakeholders, and a number of you that are around the table today are part of that platform, to really understand how the different stakeholders can better interact. And is in fact in that platform that it was our sneak preview of the study, which we think is very interesting. Now, energy efficiency and electrification of buildings is wonderful just because it has a lot of benefits. Technologies are ready. It brings energy savings in terms of reduced dependence on fossil fuel and especially on gas. It creates jobs. The study that Monica was mentioning with Cambridge Econometrics and European Climate Foundation was talking about almost 1 million jobs by 2050. But also, let's not forget, it will improve the air quality of our cities. And the latest reports by the European Environmental Agency tell us that more than 96% of EU urban population is exposed to standards that are below the ones that are set out by the World Health Organization. So again, as Eurelectric, we're really looking at this space with a lot of interest. We're looking at making sure that the user experience is seamless by promoting standardization. And again, the dialogue with Simone and the other people who are looking at how to make sure that those protocols where the different appliances talk to each other, talk to the grids, talk to the car are more seamless. We want to make sure that the work on building electrification and efficiency isn't going to empower users, the populations, the citizens. They have to feel in control. So in that sense, Thomas, I would say, yes, it is true. Sorry, Samuel, I always get your two names inverted. It is true that the economics and the regulations are important, but it is also important that governments provide unbiased information because often operators are seen as biased actors within this area. And of course, the other part, as I started and I'll finish, is the infrastructure, which includes not only the grids, but also the ICT part, the 5G. So let's make sure that we all contribute in a constructive way, and as utilities, we're doing so as Eurelectric, to the debate that is taking place right now on the digital acts that the European Commission is putting forward. And for the sake of time, I'll leave it to there, but thank you again for a very good study, and thank you for the panelists who really showing the richness of the debate that we need to make sure that we have a successful revolution and electrification and energy efficiency of building. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniele, and I'm sure that if we join our efforts, something good will come out from policies and also from the market transformation we need. I'd like to have a second fast round with our panelists to profit for their presence, and I will start from a question that arrived from Michelangelo Veta. Congrats on the study. I haven't heard anything about the primary energy factor. Would you agree that it represents a valuable instrument to encourage the use of more efficient electric solution? Now, I kindly ask Ivana, so it's a way also to involve our partner ECP in the panel discussion. What do you think about that? And say something about what we said on the primary energy factor in our study.
Of course, thank you for the question. And please, panelists, jump in if there's something I'm missing. But I can tell you our view that, in a way, European taxonomy is covering the topic of the primary energy. So among the six environmental objectives of the future investments in the area, one of the things that's very relevant is the climate mitigation. And when you look at it from the perspective of the energy in buildings and investments in energy in buildings, this means that one of the technical preconditions will be checking the primary energy, not only the final energy consumption, especially for the new builds that will need to have lower primary energy consumption that is now used as a nearly zero indicator in their country. And also for the already existing buildings, the taxonomy technical regulation includes also the primary energy as an indicator. So I think it's very relevant, and I get your point. It's very relevant for the electrification, but also it's partially, let's say, targeted through the taxonomy regulation.
Thank you, Ivana. And by the way, this is a topic which is linked by the point about statistic that Sam raised in the last part of his speech. I don't know, Sam, if you want to add something about that.
Well, I'm not an expert on the primary energy factor in the European, like the EPBD context, but I guess just from a more sort of general perspective, it is obviously important when you're thinking about the relative state of the electricity grid, so how decarbonized it is or how reliant it is on non-renewable sources, essentially, because nuclear energy has I think is 33% efficient, so a PEF of a primary energy factor, I think, of 3, although I'm not quite, so I'm no expert on nuclear power and why that is the deemed amount. It seems like a sort of statistical convention. And then obviously the fossil fuel plants have are much less than 100% efficient. So the more you decarbonize your grid, the lower your primary energy factor, and perhaps that is a good signal for where it's best to electrify end uses first if there is a constraint on heat pump markets. Although I wouldn't say it should be the only factor when you're thinking about that, because obviously the electricity systems that have got the highest primary energy factors have got the biggest potential to move quickly. So it's important that the primary energy factor reflects the expected future evolution of the grid, as well as the current status of the grid, given that the heat pump or whatever the heating technology that it's competing with will have a lifetime of 15 years or whatever the lifetime is. And all those arguments, when I was in the UK government 20 years ago, 15 years ago, all of those arguments were being thrashed out when the building regulations were being defined, because obviously all the electric wasn't so much heat pump manufacturers back then. It was more the electric resistance heating crew were wanting obviously the lowest primary energy factor possible, reflecting the future decarbonization of the grid, and all of the boiler manufacturers are saying, no, you can't just assume that the grid will decarbonize over time. You've got to take the current situation. So it becomes clearly a political football, and I'm sure that this is what's happening also when the discussions are happening in the context of the EPBD. But perhaps someone else with more knowledge of the EPBD is able to provide more details on that.
Thank you, Sam. And by the way, the use of primary energy is a little bit more complicated. This is one of the reasons why final energy consumption got used much more in the last years. That doesn't imply that, especially when we communicate the benefits of our technology, we can mention it. I just want to stress, this is an invitation mainly to technology producers and distributors, that we have a lot of energy benefits linked with our technologies, and to mention it, to highlight all these benefits and possibly to try to quantify a little bit them is a very important factor to convince our stakeholders to adopt this kind of technology.
I think, Dario, the important thing in our debate of the primary energy factor is that it also affects the energy labeling and part of how the information is provided. And often the issue with the primary energy factor is that it's not forward-looking enough. So it's looking, for instance, at the electricity mix today without keeping in consideration that the appliances that we're buying are going to be there for the next 15 years. And so the benefits are actually going to be greater simply for the fact that the electricity that we're going to be using in the next 15 years is going to get cleaner and cleaner. So I think one of the big issues, but I agree with you, it's difficult to convey to the public, but there's an important debate in some countries like France are more advanced than others in making sure that accurate information is provided to the users. Yeah,
and that's important. Of course, it can be also made through policies, but I think also the private sector in this respect can help. And by the way, to go with the last question for our panelists, we mentioned 3 types of policies that are mainly public. So, for example, the renovation rate and the phase out of fossil fuels, the removal of the market distortions, the grids and networks improvement, etc. There is a clear role of policymakers, regulators, etc. Whereas there are 2 which are supply chain and making the transition clear and transparent for the end users, that can benefit for policies, but here an important role for the value chain of the technologies. So my question is, how can policies support your technology producers and market operators in general to being able to answer these 2 types of barriers, and so to build a better supply chain and to favor the comprehension of the end users of these new technologies? You, in your sense, but let's say we are now under the limelight. We are not new in terms of technology itself. Josephine.
I'm not sure if I completely understand your question correctly. So you want to know which policies can support the supply chain, or how do you?
Yeah, what do you think we can better support the development of a supply chain in your field, of course, and how they can support technology producers in closing the gap, the informational gap with their end user and potential end users?
Yeah. Well, first of all, it's this providing this long-term certainty that I think is really key. This, I mentioned already this accelerator. It was mentioned by Sam as well, to give long-term perspective on heat pumps are the technology that are here and that are here to stay. So that investors, manufacturers, they stop betting on 2 horses and they really shift completely to investing in heat pumps. And we see that already. Only this year we have seen 15 billion announcements of investments by the different manufacturers in new heat pump factories, new heat pump production lines, shifting from fossil fuel production lines to heat pump production lines. So it's moving, but of course, to quadruple more is needed. And then to close the information gap, well, there I think it's key that you have really the skilled installers, also these one-stop shops really at local level, that people have the required correct information. As I said, also with myself, our own house that we renovated, the architect was completely against heat pumps. So we really need to let this information trickle down to really, every level. Also at the municipality here in Brussels, for example, the subsidies, if you call, they say, don't do a heat pump in the city. No, it's not possible. Like, it's really, they are not aware at this moment. So we really need to have also that an installer, for example, he comes to the house and he proposes himself a heat pump as a solution, because now I said, I want a heat pump. And he said, that's the first time I get this question. Normally the question people ask is, which heating system is best for my house? And then they come mostly up with a fossil fuel boiler still today, except maybe in a villa in the countryside. But so it's really that they also have this shift in thinking where they propose the renewable energy solution, the electrification of heating solution themselves, and that it's not only the people that are informed and that really want this, that get this. So yeah.
Thank you, Josephine. Simone, what do you think? Issues with the microphone. Okay, Quentin. In the meantime, we'll see if Simone can talk.
Yeah, no, I think for me this long-term clarity is very important, and clear information to the households, to the consumers about what are the choices available for them. So we want buildings to be zero emission. So fossil, it's not working with it. Huh? So it's not an option on the long run, and should be clear to everyone. And then I'm a bit struggling with the technology neutrality aspect, because you also need to make some choices to tell to people what are the options. You cannot make all options available to every building. So you cannot have in the same street a reinforced electrical grid so that everyone can electrify, a district heating, energy loop on which you can connect your heat pump, a hydrogen distribution network, like some people are proposing this fantasy, a biogas distribution network. So you cannot have all these options. So basically you should be able to tell to people, today you have a gas boiler. On that date, we will stop distributing gas in your city because it's fossil and we need to decarbonize. So we need to schedule the commissioning of this gas distribution. And here will be your option. So in your district, you have decided to reinforce the grid and you should put a air-to-water heat pump or air-to-air heat pump. In your district, you have decided to put an energy loop so that you will more easily have a heat pump that can take this as a heat source, or you will have a district heating. So we need to tell people what are their options. Otherwise, everyone will just go for their individual choice, or people will face a situation at the end where the gas grid is too expensive, the gas is too expensive, that people just don't have any solution, have not anticipated the needs. So that's for me something that is very important, to inform the consumer about their solution. It requires a district level approach or a city approach to have clear plans for the heating there. And then you have specific technology choices that have to be made. So yeah, technology neutrality, but you need to make some choices and inform the consumer at some point. And I think electrification will be key. District heating is a very good solution as well, where basically larger heat pump will probably produce the heat for this district heating. So these are the key solutions we have, but we need to communicate it very clearly to the consumer. And then once this long-term thing is well communicated and clear to everyone, I think that it will also help the supply chain to move to it. So if you're a gas boiler installer and you know that in 5 years you have to stop your business, then maybe you will take the time to train yourself to install heat pump, because that's the future. But if you don't know it today, they just say, I still have a order book for gas boilers. I have enough work. I will not stop for 1 week to do a training to become a heat pump installer, because they don't see that this is the reality. So us working on policies, we always look a bit longer term, but for many people being households or installers today, they just don't look at these features because they are not informed enough. So clear choice is to inform them.
Thank you. Simone, did you solve?
It should work right now. Perfect. So I agree with Quentin and Josephine about the importance of one-stop shops, the right information, in other words. Again, I come back to the fact that information should be given about the technologies, but also about legislation, because I think when we look at the legislation, it's becoming more and more complete in terms of like which requirements are needed, which technologies are needed, but sometimes there are no information, not even on what legislation is in force or should be applied. So for example, in this case, we were in touch with the Irish authorities recently, and they do events that are targeted to the specifically to the owner of certain buildings or to the people that are using certain buildings, so that they know which policies are coming for them and what is needed to apply these things. So more information, even not only about the technologies, but also about the requiremements and how to make these requirements happening. More compliance check. So even in this case, there are certain articles of the EPBD that are about the optimization of technical building systems. They are there since years, but this is not happening. So more of these can help. And I think on top, I would also add better funding so that these measures will happen. So I think you need the information about what requirements are needed, and you need funding so that in specific buildings, contrasting, addressing energy poverty, this can happen. And finally, consistency. So for example, when it comes to certain indicators, what was not working for the EPC, and we hope that for the smart readiness indicator, I mean, we are in the same discussion right now with the smart readiness indicator. We cannot end up, I mean, there are differences between the different regions and the different countries, of course, but we cannot end up with a smart readiness indicator that will be that will give you a score of 30 in Finland and 50 in Italy or Greece, or the other way around. So I think consistency in terms of like visualization of the symbol, the score, and everything, it's key for the SRI, for the EPC, and for many other tools in this field. I think for the moment, that's all.
Thank you. Daniele.
Yeah, I think it's very important. I think awareness of the legislation is very important. As Simone said, I think there's also a lot of room for just moral suasion, so coordination through platforms. It's not by chance that New Electric we created this platform powered buildings with ambition of trying to better coordinate efforts along the value chain. And so the same thing in getting the information out to users. So I think policymakers could and are encouraging this more stakeholder interaction through these platforms. And I think it's in that direction also that the accelerator that Josephine was mentioning for heat pumps would also be quite useful. So again, going beyond command and control, which is important, as Quentin, you also mentioned at some point, you have to be clear, but also using the other more communication tools that really get the users and the citizens on board, which is very important, that they understand and that they live as they're empowered in the process and they're not just victims of it.
So thank you all the panelists for their very interesting remarks and for joining our webinar. We have been very pleased and glad to have you on board. Also Monica that helped to leave early. I also wish to thank Rod Jensen, that should have been the moderator of a roundtable, but unfortunately he got dropped of his laptop yesterday evening late, and so is without the main tool to manage such a duty, and it was very afflicted both for the fact and for not being here with us. I wish to thank Enel for providing this work and for all the support they gave us during the drafting, and our partner IECP and Ivana in particular for all their great work they have done. and also all the key stakeholders that were interviewed and shared their views with us. I also wish to thank all the audience and all the people who will dedicate some time to read our study and to share their views with us, because we are open to your views. There is really a lot of work to be done to ensure that the present policies and the future ones will help us achieving the big challenges we face, and I hope that everybody can contribute to improve things. So thank you again. Thank you very much. I don't know, Ivana, if you want to make a final comment or greeting.
Only to join you with thanking all the panelists, you and also the stakeholders that were involved in the interviews and the audience, of course.
Thank you very much to all of you, and I remind you that you can find everything, the registration, the study, etc., on our website, and I hope to see you soon in presence, if possible, in some of the events that deal with energy efficiency and decarbonization. Have a nice day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye. Bye-bye to everybody.